the last few points that would be useful to note, not so much because they're going to be directly, they're not going to be directly covered on this exam, but it's some good background information to keep in mind, because I know that some of this was on the homework packet. And since you're going to be doing some more review of the homework packet, we should talk a little bit about the tests that can be done to differentiate obstructive and restrictive disorders. This is more important, however, for the spirometry lab and the lab exam. We'll kind of get just a quick head start on that here. For the spirometry lab, we could use different types of volume readings here. One would be the static spirometer, which is what's being shown here, where we're just getting volumes. We're not taking any component of time into account here. We're not asking how long can you exhale, how much can you exhale over a certain period of time, right? Just how much can you exhale overall. And so typically when we do the static spirometry, we're asking the individual to take slow, deep breaths out so that we can maximize the volume measurements as much as possible to get accurate readings here. However, there is a type of spirometry that's called dynamic spirometry. And if you haven't done the spirometry lab yet, you'll see that there's a few videos where you watch the dynamic spirometry. And this does have a time component. It's much like an EKG. As you're doing your exhalations, the machine is tracing on a piece of paper, right, those exhalations, and the paper is running at a certain speed. So we can then calculate the amount of time it takes you to exhale a certain amount of air, which is useful for determining whether an individual might have an obstructive disorder. And we can actually use that information, that reading as well, to determine if an individual has a restrictive disorder. That's possible from those dynamic spirometry readings. And the type of reading that we can take to discern these respiratory disorders is called the forced vital capacity, or the percent FVC, also known as the FEV1 FVC ratio. That's typically how I describe it, FEV1 over FVC ratio. And what this is describing is how quickly you can forcibly exhale, right? We know that's a problem with individuals that have obstructive disorders. When they forcibly exhale, they trap air when they try to do that quickly, right? They have collapse of those smallest of bronchioles, where the individual that has emphysema, for instance, with the loss of the attractive forces upon a forcible exhale, they definitely are collapsing those smallest of bronchioles and trapping air. So what we're asking here is, when you take your forced inspiratory reserve volume, when you take in as much air as you can take in on top of a normal inspiration, and then you forcibly exhale as much and as quickly as possible, how much air do you exhale in the first second? The FEV is the forced expiratory volume in the first second. FVC is a reading for the total volume that you have forcibly exhaled, right? So the ratio here for an individual that has no obstructive disorder should be 80% or higher. 80% or higher. 90%, 95%, that's great. But definitely 80% or higher. Less than 80%, on the cusp of that, requires more testing. 60% or lower is definitely an indication of an obstructive disorder. If you can only exhale 60% of what you initially inhaled, right, during that forced exhalation in the first second, that's problematic. That means you're trapping lots of air. So what we would do with this type of dynamic spirometer is have an individual breathe in as much as they can, and then into a tube, into the spirometer machine, breathe out as forcibly and as quickly as possible. And so it wouldn't be, that's not what we want to see. We want to see them go, right? And try to go as quickly as possible. And then we take measurements on that reading. So the reading comes out like this, okay? Breathe in and now breathe out. And we get a reading like that. And that's all we get. And then we have to go in and we have to take actual measurements on this reading to determine the volume they breathed out in the first second versus the total volume that they exhaled, right? We get the ratio between those two volumes. Should be 80% or better for it to be considered normal. You see for the individual with the obstructive disorder, their FEV is very small, and their FVC, the total amount that they forcibly exhaled, is less than for the normal individual, right? Meaning we know that they're trapping air. They started with the same volume, but they haven't breathed out all that they have inhaled. Haven't exhaled all that they inhaled. So there's trapping of air, and just a fraction has been exhaled in the first second. So here we're showing that the individual has a ratio, FEV1 to FVC, of 42%. When we look at those two volumes, compare them. It's definitely below 60%, which would indicate obstructive. Over here, for C, this is an individual that has a restrictive disorder. They have a problem inhaling, right, to take in air, just expanding the lungs upon inhalation, whether that's a problem with the muscles of ventilation or the chest wall and any deformities related with that, or a problem with the compliance of the tissue, surfactant production, what have you. It's a problem getting air in. And so what we should see is that the amount of air that they exhale reflects the amount of air that they took in, and it will be less. Their FVC is low as well. So you see their FVC is low, like it is for the obstructive disorder. Less in, less out is what we're seeing here. But their FEV, the amount that they can forcibly exhale in the first second, is typically not a problem for the individual with a restrictive disorder. Their problem is getting air in, not a problem with increased resistance upon exhalation. So it's not a problem getting air out. So they're able to expel about 80% of what they inhaled in the first second. They might have a normal FEV1 to FVC ratio, right? So it's not their ratio that would be indicative of restrictive. It would be the fact that they have a normal ratio, but their FVC is much lower than normal. Normal ratio, low FVC. Those two things combined suggest a restrictive disorder. Obstructive, right? Low ratio and low FVC, obstructive disorder. Normal ratio and normal FVC. Okay. And that's how we would be able to differentiate an obstructive restrictive disorder compared to normal with this type of test. And we're going to be working with some diagrams like this. We're going to be making these measurements during our spirometry lab on Thursday after class, because I want you to be able to do these quick calculations for the lab exam. And so I'll show you how to do those during lab on Thursday.
Hey, Professor, just very quickly for restrictive, Sunny said in the chat that it should be 90%.
Oh, let's see here. Did they do the math wrong on this diagram? If they did,
It should be 90.
Yeah, that's fine. So if this is, no one's noticed that before, 90%, that's still normal, right? In labs, sometimes I see people have 95, 97%, really good FEV, FVC ratios. But that's interesting. No one's pointed this out before, that is wrong. And this I think this came from some textbook as well. I'll have to look into that to see where this diagram originally came from. but I've never noticed that before. Thank you, Sunny, for pointing that out here. But still, the idea is we would see a normal, right, ratio. But when we look at the FVC itself, we see that that volume is too low. What it's showing us is that obstructive, we see that the functional residual capacity, the FRC that we were discussing earlier, which is a volume that describes both the expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume, right? The amount of air that, that still remains in the lungs after a normal exhalation. With an obstructive disorder, that functional residual capacity is large. And that's mainly because there's an increase in the residual volume, increase in the amount of air that cannot be removed, right, due to the air trapping that's occurring. So this is definitely increased. And for the individual with the restrictive disorder, what we see, because they're taking less in and they have less going out, their functional residual capacity decreases overall, mainly because their residual volume is greatly reduced. They're taking less in, so less goes out, right? And so when they forcibly take less in, they're forcibly expiring less as well. The combination of those two decreasing gives us a smaller functional reserve capacity. For the individual with a restrictive disorder, could they have a normal tidal volume, a normal inspiratory reserve volume? They look somewhat similar to normal. We just have to keep in mind that they're expending more work in order to take in that air compared to the normal individual and their normal and forced inspiration.